Welcome everyone to this session. Our topic is Eurasia in a new global context. My name is Ghida Fakhry. I'm a presenter for TRT World based in Washington, D.C. I'm also the moderator of the soon-to-be relaunched Doha debates, and I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this discussion with such prominent panelists. Now, if there is one region today that is emblematic of all the rising geopolitical and geoeconomic rivalries that the world is seeing today, then it is, without a doubt, Eurasia, but perhaps more specifically Central Asia, which has been a very fast-growing region in the last decade, and of course neighboring South Caucasus as well. They have become focal points for changing political alliances and, of course, strategic infrastructure projects. They've also been trying to redefine their role within this new changing landscape. It's certainly a region in flux, a lot of movement, a lot of recent political changes as well, not just in Georgia, but in Armenia as well, and in neighboring Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, as well as an economic opening that we're seeing and quite a few institutional reforms that are taking place. Now, with its huge economic potential, its landmass, this is a region that stretches, after all, from Lisbon all the way to Shanghai, that covers more than 35% of the Earth's total landmass and has more than 70% of the world's population. This is a region where the race is certainly on. But how are the big powers positioning themselves today? Will whoever controls the trade routes be the ultimate decision maker? Will that power be able to dictate strategy and policy and be the ultimate hegemon? How will China's Belt and Road Initiative shape the new map of the region at a time when the clout of the United States certainly is receding? It's an opportunity for regional powers as well to impose themselves, perhaps more than they have in the past, Turkey and Iran. How does it affect the EU? How will the European Union position itself? Will it cling to old alliances, or will it perhaps begin to look further east? Well, a lot of questions, I think, and a fantastic panel to help us answer those. We've got an hour. We, of course, want to make this discussion as dynamic as possible, so we will open the floor to questions a little later on. But let me begin with you, Prime Minister of Georgia, Mamuka Bakhtadze. You've been in office since June 2018, having previously been finance minister and director of the Georgian Railway Company. You also made a shift from the private sector, where you were CEO of the Georgian International Energy Corporation. At just 36, I hope you won't mind me saying so, at just 36, you represent a new, young, dynamic leadership within this region. How do you see the trends that are taking place right now?
Thank you, Ghida. Good morning, everybody. Well, I think it won't be a surprise for the audience if I will say that the region itself has tremendous economic potential. We, as Georgia, we are serving these 8 landlocked countries you have mentioned, and we are the gateway for this very important region. And I do believe that in coming years, this region will become the main driver of the economic growth on the entire Eurasian continent. Also, of course, we see that there is some turbulence going on in some part of this region. Anyway, I'm very confident that the economic prospect of the region is really very bright.
You say the economic prospects are very bright. Obviously, you have been trying to push quite hard to make Georgia become, once again, an economic and transport hub. In fact, in your previous role, you pushed for something called the Middle Corridor Initiative, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but interestingly, it doesn't have any Chinese investments, when I was interested to find out that 89% of the Belt and Road Initiative projects are awarded to Chinese companies. I wonder why. Is it that the region is trying to reimpose itself and regain some kind of independence and autonomy?
Well, if you look at the map, of course, Georgia is a natural candidate to become a regional hub for business and transportation and logistics. And therefore, we are investing so heavily in infrastructure. We regard ourselves as a bridge from Europe to Asia. Our historical roots are European, and therefore our outlook is also European, but at the same time, Georgia is located at this crossroads of civilizations. Yeah, so, and of course, we regard ourselves as a bridge.
Does it mean that you're trying to look further towards the European Union and less toward China?
Well, we would like to facilitate to the trade and to the very increasing volumes of trade between Asia and Europe, between China and European Union. And you know that at the same time, Georgia is the only country in the region that has free trade agreement with both European Union and China simultaneously. So I see here a big synergy, I would say. So I don't see it as a kind of two big competitors. I see it as a very big synergy. And of course, Georgia, we as a country that has the European aspiration and European outlook can play a very important and vital role in this. And let me repeat myself again, we see ourselves as a bridge to connect two largest economic platforms with each other.
And quite literally trying to connect Central Asia and the region to China and Europe through this billion-dollar railway
Yes.
that goes from Georgia, Azerbaijan and Turkey.
Yes, because we are the gateway for these 8 landlocked countries, and with the new logistical routes, of course, we will be able to unlock the very big economic value that really does exist in these countries.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Let me try to get the European perspective if I can. Karin Kneißl, you are the Foreign Minister of Austria, which held the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. It's interesting to look at how the Europeans view the region, because it seems to me that for centuries, Europe saw themselves quite distinct to Asia. On the one hand, they perceive themselves as being sort of the more technologically advanced, forward-looking part of that region, whereas the Asians were perhaps looked at as being more static, perhaps even backward. I hate to use the word, certainly undeveloped. Things have changed dramatically, haven't they? When you hear the Prime Minister of Georgia talk about how his country is positioning itself, both looking toward the EU, but also toward China, where does it leave you, the Europeans? Are you playing catch-up with China? Where do you see yourself?
Well, first of all, I may start by saying geography is back. And it's not for the first time that we should study geography in more detailed terms. The famous British geographer Harold Mackinder, without using the term geopolitics, you can perfectly well call him the father of all geopolitics. And he was the one who actually criticized the maritime obsession of the then colonial might of the United Kingdom by saying you have to go to Central Asia, that's where the heartland is, and it was all about controlling. And then we didn't have a single idea about the oil and gas reserves in that region. Or when you look at the statements of the late Charles de Gaulle, he was preaching the idea of Paris, Berlin, Moscow. And I don't fully agree with what you said, that looking at Asia at backward, not at all. It was always looking at Asia as the cradle of civilization. I mean, Europe wouldn't have been created without all what came from the East. I mean, I'm a passionate scholar of Latin and ex oriente lux. That's how we were brought up in our humanistic education. And I always also claim orientation comes from Orient. So we always looked to the Orient, for the better or for the worse. So I don't fully agree with this kind of that Europe would have looked at Asia. It might hold true for some, but not for the general European spirit in terms of philosophy and so on. About the EU.
What about the EU perspective? And then I wanted to move on to Austria more specifically as a bridge builder.
Yeah. So now the EU has created its connectivity strategies with regard to China. And I had the honor to chair during our presidency some of the cooperation councils we have, for instance, with Uzbekistan. And here you get the clear-cut impression and idea. They want to look also to the EU. It's all about diversification. You don't want to depend on one client. Winston Churchill was fully right when he said liberty lies in diversity and in diversity alone. So whether you supply or whether you demand something, whether it's about commodities, whether it's about political, military partners, you diversify. This is a natural attitude, and that's where the EU is as a partner.
But in terms of what drives the EU, of course, beyond what we all know is the huge tapped and untapped economic potential of the region, the energy resources and the rest of it. To what extent is EU policy, and I speak to you as someone who is an expert, an author, someone who studied the region of the Middle East, so the wider region, who knows very well the complexities of the region. To what extent has the security dimension and this whole so-called perceived Muslim threat also factored in to the way the EU is approaching this, with Austria having, been a bridge between East and West, traditionally the Austro-Hungarian Empire having stopped the Ottoman Empire in its tracks in Vienna, and with a lot of these countries that we're talking about being predominantly Muslim.
Yeah, but I may say that when we speak about interests, we speak about economic interests, we speak about political, diplomatic gateways that you want to build, but we don't look at all that through a pair of glasses called religion. Certainly not. I mean,
security.
Yeah, but when we speak of Eurasia, I mean, it's there's so many religions, there's so many ethnic developments, and when you speak about the big powers today in Eurasia, China has nothing to do with religion. I mean, when you speak with a Chinese counterpart on the Islamic world, for instance, they don't make this distinction between Shia and Sunni, which is part of the whole thing, but they simply don't do it, and it's about clear-cut economic interests. So I don't want to dwell into a debate on religion with all my due respect for the element of clash of civilization, etc. We read it, we know it, it's there, no doubt about it, but speaking about Eurasia and having quoted Harold Mackinder, Charles de Gaulle, and others, it's really about very genuine economic interests. And for instance, also you mentioned my past as an author. A few years ago, I took the leisure to work in the OPEC library on a longer text on oil and gas reserves in the Caspian Basin. When you read the papers of the early 1990s, wherever they were published, it's all about Turkey, Iran, and the United States, the new big race, the new chessboard, etc. Nobody mentioned the People's Republic of China then. So now it's there, it's the actor, it's not just the investor, it's the geopolitical actor. And that's where I'm a strong believer that the European Union should work on wherever it can on equal level.
So work with China.
Work with China, work with everybody on a partnership, but on clear-cut conditions.
Clear-cut conditions. Sumantra Chakrabarti, you are the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, which has been active for very many years, I believe some 27 years in Central Asia and all 5 republics. It's the largest single investor in the region, with $14 billion invested over this amount of time. You said, just speaking recently in Beijing at a forum, that Central Asia is now the world's most economically dynamic region, or one of. It had the highest growth in 2018 of any of the regions where the EBRD operates. But you still sounded a word of caution. You said that the region, or at least you believed 2-3 years ago when you were sitting here in Davos talking about the same issue, you believed that this region had to work twice as hard to attract investment. Is that still the case?
Thank you very much. I mean, I think, first of all, EBRD, another title book for it might be the Eurasian Bank, actually, for Reconstruction and Development. And I'm probably the first Eurasian head of the EBRD as well, given my own roots, and I hope not the last. I think, without a doubt, this has been becoming a very dynamic region. I think for many, many years, during the era of communism, this was a region that had got locked out of the economic system, global economic system. And I think in the last 25 years, what we've seen is a re-emergence of this region. You know, we can talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, or the Silk Road, New Silk Road, and so on. But beyond that, actually, I don't think it's just about the great powers and their interest in the region. I think it's actually the region and its leadership that's changed. Young leaders like Mamuka, but many others as well, who have been transforming their countries in the Caucasus and in Central Asia to become much more dynamic. So it's true, last year, I think the region grew by about 4.6%, the fastest growing region for EBRD, for sure, and the prospects are pretty good this year too. Why is that? Now, it's partly because that leadership has decided to take on some challenges that some other parts of the world that we operate in are still avoiding. About investment climate, for example. How to change the investment climate so foreign investors and domestic investors want to put their money at stake in the region. You know, it's great. I mean, I was just teasing him before, Mamuka, that he's now managed to move up to 6th. Georgia is now 6th in the World Bank's Doing Business Survey League table, sandwiched between South Korea and Norway. Of course, typical of Mamuka, he says, yeah, but we want to be in the top 3. I mean, this is an economy that's moving.
Sure, there are some success stories, no doubt.
There are others as well. I mean,
But-
you know, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan
But
now.
would you agree that this is still a region that makes a lot of investors nervous? Let's face it, there's still a lot of unresolved conflicts going on. And as you once pointed out, investors are looking for stable, solid foundations and environments in which they can invest.
Investors look for a number of things. First of all, they look for an investment climate that actually makes it worthwhile taking the risk to invest. That climate is made up of many things. One is stability in policy. So it's not that they want only one government or one party always ruling. No, it's not that case. But they want to make long-term decisions about investments. They want to know if there is a change, if there is a shift in party control of the government, that actually the policies in their areas will not change radically, massively. And that is the case in Europe, in Eastern Europe. We've seen, for example, changes in policy on renewable energy, which has led actually to investors pulling out. And the good thing we've got at the moment with the Central Asian Caucasus is there is this sort of sense of the long-term interest of the country trumping, if I may use that word, trumping the interest of party politics.
And you say that these countries need to become more resilient by investing themselves from local sources of investment. Do you feel in any way, I know you've been quite positive about the whole Belt and Road Initiative, but do you feel that too much investment is going into the hands of China? Therefore, China is really controlling too much of what's going on and indebting quite a few of these countries in the process.
There is a huge debate as to what is a Belt and Road Initiative. Different people keep different league tables as to what scores as one and what doesn't. I would say, leaving aside the sort of political Sturm und Drang about the Belt and Road Initiative, I think the thing to focus on is the desire really to invest massively in infrastructure, energy and other sectors in this region, and the importance then of having high quality investments. So you're right, I think, to signal that in some cases I have been open and said, I don't think some of these investments were good investments. They were low quality. I can name roads in the Western Balkans that I wouldn't have invested in.
And so
I
can
can
we
name
really-
debt sustainability issues as
But
well.
so can we really leave the Belt and Road Initiative aside? I mean, can you, when it's just omnipresent? And just let me follow up on what I've just said. In terms of debts of the countries involved, Chinese loans have accounted for 49% of public debt in Tajikistan, 38% in Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah.
Those are huge numbers.
Those are huge numbers, and I think I think the Chinese administration is wary now of adding to those pressures. Certainly, in my conversations with them, I think there's also a realization. By the way, China is not a homogenous country. We always talk about China as they have one view. They don't. There's a wide spectrum of views in the administration as well. And the Liberals in that administration also recognise the need for private sector investment much more, which wouldn't add to debt burden. So I think there is an important thing. And here, I think EBRD, working with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, based in Beijing, China's largest shareholder, but it's a multilateral bank. Many Europeans are shareholders, Central Asian shareholders, Caucasus are shareholders. This is the bank that is actually trying to have the right standards, and working with them, in co-financing with them, is actually the right way forward.
Suma Chakrabarti, we talk about all the main players, Vali Nasser, the Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, also a former advisor at the US State Department. So we've talked about the powers, the organizations that are in this fast-moving region, but there's one absentee, it seems to me these days, the United States. Where is it in this whole picture?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is that it's not there at all. And early on, when Central Asia and the Caucasus separated from the Soviet Union, the United States made a bid to be present there, invest in particularly energy, and also in security issues, but it's now increasingly absent. I mean, it's also important to sort of note that, when we talk about Eurasia, this is largely a concept that is being crafted in Asia rather than the Europe part. And this idea that there's a sort of the geographic landmass could be a strategic unitarian concept is coming from the East. And it's also an evolving concept. Some of the players in the region are looking to the West, particularly in the Caucasus, or maybe even Kazakhstan. And many of them are also looking to the East. Some are looking to the South, like Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, more towards Iran, some are looking towards India. So I don't think even within the region, strategically speaking, there is one unitary view. And actually the withdrawal of the United States has helped this kind of fracturing of which direction do you look. It's also sort of important to think that the big players in this region, at least the ones who sought to sort of give shape to a regional understanding, particularly around the concept of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia, China, and Iran, and now Turkey added to it, are distinctly keen. They look at this region as their backyard, as their strategic backyard, and they don't want the United States there. In fact, if the one thing that all of them agree on is that this sort of in the spirit of Shanghai Cooperation Council, this should be a regional, it should be a region that they essentially control, and the less the United States is present, the better. And I think partly the economic investment and development is driven at integrating this region, particularly with China, but also with Russia and with Iran and Turkey, to the exclusion of the United States. And I finally would say for them, particularly for China, the Central Asia and Caucasus provide an alternative to what they see as the Malacca Straits problem. You know, is that the United States has the command of the high seas. It can always choke them. When we first thought about One Belt, One Road, we thought about a string of pearls ports that go all the way from Asia to the east coast of Africa. But the concept of a Silk Road, the new Silk Road as a definition for Belt and Road, essentially means creating this linkage via land. And that makes integration of Central Asia and Caucasus into what might be bigger strategic and economic concepts that China obviously has the economic wherewithal, but Iran and Russia are ultimately supportive because they see it as coming at the cost of a U.S. presence in the region.
Yeah, and many are wondering if the United States won't end up becoming more and more some kind of an island in this rapidly changing part of the world that is so strategically important. But I wonder, coming from Washington as you do, and speaking to a lot of policymakers and business leaders, how much concern, how much anxiety you feel there is, not just about China's growing influence in this region and beyond, but also by the fact that these new alliances are also opening up a lot of potential for countries like Iran specifically to move on.
And also certain opportunities for Russia. I think the problem in the United States...
specifically, how much does that worry the US?
Not enough, if I would say. I think as far as China is concerned, the United States' conception of China is East Asia, as if China is only along the east coast of China. It's a Pacific problem. The United States still does not see any kind of a Chinese economic expansion or even security presence in Western Asia, its investments in Pakistan, in Iran, potentially in Turkey, still as strategically relevant. Its absence in any kind of a US-China conversation. Iranians don't have the economic means to invest in Central Asia, and I think in the current sanctions regime, they can't even offer, let's say, an easy route for gas and oil to come from Turkmenistan and go onto ports on, let's say, Chabahar port, which India has invested in. So all of these sort of are theoretically there. Once there's an opening, it'd be key. And I think that's part of the conversation. One of the big issues between India and the United States was that the port of Chabahar, which the Indians have invested in as an alternate route to Central Asia, would be exempted from US sanctions.
Thank you for that. Let me move on to our last panelist before we perhaps open the floor to some questions. Shiv Vikram Khemka, you are Vice Chairman of Sun Group, a private investment group, which I believe has a lot of extensive experience in Russia and India specifically, across many different sectors, but focusing on gas and oil, a region which has long been associated with these commodities, perhaps now changing, and with more people realizing that this is a region that has a lot to offer when it comes to the technologically driven, innovative sectors as well. I wonder how much you can talk to us about that and tell us where India fits within this whole picture, because we often focus on China when it comes to Asia, but India is the other big power that's being relatively ignored.
So our group has been working in Central Asia for 20 years now and investing in Central Asia. And we've been investing in Russia and working with Russia for 60 years. So we have some experience in that region. I think that I think Central Asia is actually a remarkable success story. If you look at Kazakhstan, you look at the amazing leadership shown by President Nazarbayev very early on, and I would say a strategic realization by him that he needed to balance the geopolitics of the region, building relationships with the US, with Europe, with Russia, with China, and with other countries in a very thoughtful way, because it was a very fragile time in the early 90s, and his leadership, I think, showed the way to other Central Asian countries. And he's done an incredible job, I think, in Central Asia to create an engine of growth. India has been very focused on Indian issues for a long time, and only recently, I'd say, in the last few years, has India started to play a more active role in Central Asia. The president of Uzbekistan was in India recently, and I think our prime minister has made visits to Central Asia. And I think the Chinese were very early off the blocks. And, you know, much before Belt and Road Initiative, in fact, it was announced in Kazakhstan. Before that, the Chinese had already invested very significantly in Central Asia, in oil, gas, mining, and other things. If I look at Central Asia, and I know Central Asia better than I know the Caucasus, if I look at Central Asia, I really see a number of things. First is location. The location of Central Asia is very strategic from a transport point of view and logistics point of view. The second thing, I think, is the energy and mining resources. You know, if you look at the resources in that region, it can really fuel growth in China and India, the type of growth that we need. So they really become partners with Russia, or competitors slightly, but partners with Russia in feeding and fueling China, India's growth, Southeast Asia's growth, which is quite significant. India is growing at 8%, and China is growing at 6%. So that's a significant growth for those economies.
And India on its way to becoming the most populous country in the world.
Yes, as well.
In a few years.
Yes.
How does it look at this potential new Eurasian order with all of its problems? Certainly not a well-integrated region yet by any stretch of the imagination, but how does it look of a potential Eurasian order under the hegemony of China?
But I think India has recently become a member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. India has some issues with Belt and Road Initiative, particularly concerning the China-Pakistan economic corridor. But otherwise, I think investment in energy, infrastructure, dry ports, ports, logistics, and certainly at the SCO meetings, the discussion is always that it should be broad-based. That yes, China is very important, but everyone's welcome to participate and really build out this connectivity for the region, which will increase growth and so on, and connect Europe and Asia in a more deep way. So I think India is a new participant and starting to get more involved, and I think has a positive attitude towards that.
Prime Minister,
Yes.
you had something to say.
In your previous question, Ghida, you mentioned about the position of United States. United States is our strategic partner, and for example, the US-Georgia relations is on an all-time high level, and we see a deepening of our cooperation in both dimensions, in security and also in the field of economics and business. But at the same time, yes, I would agree that in the region, these countries may have various international aspirations. And of course, for example, the aspiration of Georgia, and we are fully committed to this idea, is to become the full members of NATO and European Union. But at the same time, as Mr. Hemke mentioned, so there is a very big value unlocked in Central Asia. And the major obstacle to unlock this value for the global economy is, of course, transportation and logistics. In Georgia, we are constructing a deep sea port to help these nations to trade with the rest of the world, to decrease their cost of logistics, to make them more competitive. So I don't think that this kind of the various international aspirations is an obstacle in this case, because there's a very big economic interest. I totally agree with you, and so I don't regard it as an obstacle.
Karen Teissel, I want to turn to you just briefly to talk about Russia and put the Russian situation, the tensions that still exist, the conflicts with some of the countries in the region over the Ukraine issue, in a bit of context. To what extent is it important for the EU to push toward the easing of some of these tensions as a way to not just restore some trust between the conflicting parties, but to allow these countries to fulfill their potential? Something interesting that the EBRD said recently was that the situation has created substantial collateral damage with a 5% contraction of the GDP of some of these countries. So essentially, has the EU, has the US put themselves in a box? I mean, they talk the talk, but you don't seem to walk the walk.
Well, it was a Franco-US general who told me once upon a time, for preventive diplomacy, you never earn a medal for bravery in the field. So certain things are happening behind the curtains. You don't see them, can talk, call them a lot of talk, but here, in particular within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, from Vladivostok to Vancouver, this ideal of a big forum, of a marketplace where actually you meet in Vienna every Thursday morning to discuss. Sometimes you attack each other, but at least you are in contact. And this East-West issue, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Southeast Europe, and going more to the East, Caucasus, the old issues of Nagorno-Karabakh, etc., they remain as constant factors. And here we have within the OSCE cumbersome, but here and there successful mediation, preventive diplomacy. It's happening. And
is everyone on the same page?
Europe, yeah, they're European diplomats. I mean, for instance, we have at least 2 Austrian diplomats who really succeeded by making the Minsk Accords somehow work. And it's for the sake of the civilian population, because we have 6 million Ukrainians living in the eastern parts, war zone, and they are out of touch with the social system, which is located in Kiev. So in order to make their daily struggle for survival, for somehow a dignified life workable, here you have EU diplomats, you have national diplomats who work for the OSCE and who make certain things happen. It's happening. Unfortunately, it's happening too slow, too cumbersome, etc. But the one or the other thing has been achieved. And again, you don't see them, you don't know the people who are behind, who made it happen. But also during our presidency of the OSCE, we managed to get certain things between Moldova and Transnistria done. And here it's all about the East-West conflict. It's still there. Or if you remember Max van der Stoel, a Dutch diplomat who was in the very early days of the OSCE High Commissioner on Minorities, he made it happen that there was no major outbreak on minority issues between Hungary and Romania. It could have happened. It didn't happen. So it's all about the genuine diplomacy, preventive diplomacy, because whenever war happens, diplomacy failed. And so, yes, for the sake of things are happening, but luckily behind the scenes, that's where diplomacy should work.
Okay, on this note, shall we turn to a few questions? We have one here. Would you please kindly introduce yourself briefly and a brief, concise question to the panelists?
From company CNCEC. Actually, I have a different opinion. Actually, Georgia, I have visited Georgia for more than 10 times. Georgia is a very nice and beautiful country. And also, actually, the leader of Georgia is also very professional. Actually, it's a Western concept. But on the other side...
Your question.
Micro.
Okay. But on the other side, actually, the Georgia also, the infrastructure also need upgrading. And also building need upgrading. They need many, technology and also even capital injections. Actually, we do the project. I have been visited there more than 10 times. Actually, Georgia, they need the good technology, not only, for example, from China all over the world. We do the project not through automatically give to us. Actually, we are get from international bidding. We compete with USA company, Turkey company. Finally, because our technology is good, price competitive, so we get project. Not because the Georgia automatically give the project to Chinese company.
Thank you. We'll have to leave it there, but I think we got the gist of the question.
Secondly,
let's put it to the Prime Minister of Georgia. Are you doing enough, in fact, to advance technologically, and are you able to rely enough on yourselves?
Of course, I fully agree that we have to upgrade our infrastructure, we have to create a new one, we have to make our transportation system more competitive. But at the same time, we are looking for the private sector-driven projects. We do believe that the private sector can implement and realize this project in the most efficient way. And of course, in this respect, we are trying not to increase our state debt, and with attracting more private investment, implement all these, I would say, historical infrastructure projects. At the same time, of course, Georgia is trying to be more attractive for the high-tech investments as well. So we created and crafted, I think, a very creative reform, which we're going to launch in the second half of the year. Because I think that the region itself needs a diversification, and I think that Georgia is a very good example, because in the last years, we could diversify our economy, but unfortunately still a big number of our neighbors, they are very heavily dependent on prices, on commodities. So I think that in this respect, Georgia can be a very good example to show that diversification is a right policy. And personally, I'm very happy when my colleagues from the neighbor country, they are approaching us and telling us to share our experience and the experience of the reforms that we already implemented in Georgia.
Do we have another question from the audience? Please go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, hello. My name is Lohia from Indorama. I live in Indonesia and London, and I heard lots about Georgia. Our team has visited, and they are talking for some projects there. I just saw the leadership in action. I'm really very excited that this will be a great country. We are in Uzbekistan and another 32 countries. So these are new countries, but I hope new countries are always most challenging, but they are most rewarding. Thank you.
Suma Chakrabarti, would you take this question, mentioning Uzbekistan and
Yeah,
the huge strides the country
I think
has made?
Uzbekistan is a really interesting story right now. This was a country, even after the Soviet Union fell, that really didn't engage with the rest of the world. And it stayed very much as a closed place, politically, socially, economically. And it had lots of problems internally, but it also had lots of problems with its neighbors. It was in our continuous argument with the Tajiks, with the Kazakhs, everyone. After the death of Mr. Karimov, the previous president, the new president has started a huge reform movement. It's like an economic and political revolution is taking place. It has opened up. We were in the deep freeze in terms of relationship with Uzbekistan for some 15 years. I tried all sorts of ways to try and have a reset. I even pleaded with them that in the heart of every Indian there is Uzbek blood. So that didn't work either. But finally what did work was actually a change of president. And then they really opened up massively, and we have now come back. We invested 350 million in the first year of euros in a wide range of sectors. Huge investment opportunities. What's really striking though is how they've opened up to their neighbours. So cross-border projects now are possible. There's discussions about trade barriers between the countries and how to reduce them. Flights are now taking place between these countries. Uzbekistan is really interesting.
And they've had
because,
to, haven't they, because of the young population that they
very
have
young
to deal with.
population, but it's also a very diversified economy. Always in Soviet times, it's always actually quite a diversified economy. Say Kazakhstan, which is very dominated by oil and gas and needs to diversify more, Uzbekistan actually doesn't have that, that boon or the curse of oil and gas. It has everything. So there's a huge opportunity here. If anything, I think the issue for EBRD is sometimes to say to our Uzbek friends, if you want to do 25 privatizations next year, which is what they said to me, the president, I said it would be good to do 2 really well, and then let's do more after that. It's almost the expectations are so high now of making that leap that they were denied for 25 odd years. So I'm really pleased with the opportunities there. And by the way, Georgia is also one of our top performers now. So And it's a very diversified performance in Georgia. And what I think Mamuka is right about is how Georgia has reached out to the European Union, for sure, and that's their destination as the government looks at it. But it's also reached out to the Gulf, it's reached out to Russia, it's reached out to China, and India as well. Indian investors have come in with us into the steel industry and the energy industry in Georgia.
Interesting, the directions in which countries are looking. Georgia obviously looking toward the EU, but also NATO, which could be a double-edged sword. I'll come to that in a second, but to you first, Karin Kneissel, I think, to follow up on this point.
Yeah, in early 2003, I had the pleasure to teach as a guest lecturer for a very brief period in Tashkent. And what I remember from then, you said it didn't engage too much. That was just a time when it engaged a lot with NATO. We had a NATO basis there. You would see carpets in the bazaar with "We love NATO" tapestry. So it then engaged a lot. And when most of the male students told me, I learned Turkish, and I wanted to emigrate to Turkey. Turkey was like the America for the Italians of the early 20th century. And that held true for many, many young people in Central Asia. So the migration movement, studying Turkish, going to Turkey, make money there, live also in an atmosphere of liberty, create a family, get a status as a young man. So this is something that I observed a lot as a teacher in Tashkent. And what I also observed then was, and that I think is still a matter of also doing business, the ones, and I was teaching both in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, the ones you could really do work with in a professional way, and I speak as an individual, I was not an investor, I was not a company there, was the female Russian population. I mean, they are really the hard-working, reliable people. The young men, as I said, they migrate. You also have a tremendous high figure of foreign fighters from Uzbekistan. You have the Fergana Valley problem. You have and still what is still a matter is the concept of nation state. The borders that were drawn by Stalin in the late 1920s that are still there, that are contested. And the fact of ethnic strife, you mentioned religion before, and it has more to do with ethnicity than with religion. Speaking Arabic, I went to the mosque sometimes. People approached me in Russian because they thought I was one of the Russian. Unfortunately, I don't speak a word of Russian. But at the central mosque in Tashkent, I could understand everything very well. Why? Because it was sponsored inter alia by Gulf states. So this is also something that you have to bear in mind. And here, I feel sorry for certain layers of the population. And here I think mostly of Turkmenistan. It also holds true for Kazakhstan. It happened 3-4 generations ago that people who lived with their animals in a very free spirit were obliged to settle in a skyscraper in the 1940s, 50s. And that has led to a tremendous sadness. People were broken somehow, and this is still there. So this is something I think what should not be neglected, what has happened to the population. And it doesn't go away in the 5th or 6th generation. There's still a sadness, a life of liberty that you had to exchange with living in a skyscraper. And here I come back to what I said, doing business, working. It's the Russian women you can work with.
You mentioned Russia. We'll touch on that in a minute, but I do want to get back to you, Prime Minister Bakhtadze, for a second to talk about what we heard Mrs. Kneissel mention. And of course, as an Arabic speaker, I can attest to how good your Arabic is, having made a whole speech, or at least part of a speech, to the UN General Assembly in Arabic.
Yeah, thank you.
Quite extraordinary. But back to Georgia's desire to accede to the EU and NATO. Clearly, you have set out your priorities, and there's quite a bit to gain out of this partnership if you do accede eventually, and all signs are that you may, because there's a lot of positive talk coming out of the European Union, certainly saying that they are very much dedicated to your regional stability and integrity. But I wonder, from your perspective, looking at joining NATO, to what extent could it be counterproductive, given the fact that it has created and caused quite a bit of conflict to begin with within Ukraine, and looking back at the policies pursued by then President Saakashvili, the loss of territory? Is it time for you to be more realistic, perhaps, if you ever want to regain control of the territories of South Ossetia and Abkhazia?
Well, unfortunately, Russia continues to occupy 20% of our territory. And although Russia is taking the aggressive steps against Georgia, our answer to this, I would say, the most painful challenge is, of course, the consolidation of our democracy and rapid and sustainable development of our economy. So when we are talking about the international aspirations of Georgia, even yesterday I heard that one expert was saying that this is a political choice of Georgia to join EU family, for example. Of course, it's not a best answer to this question. This is our civilizational choice because, as I have mentioned, our roots are European, therefore our outlook is European.
But Russia feels the region is also its sphere of influence traditionally.
You asked the question about NATO, for example, yes. I think that if Georgia joins NATO, that will be in the best interest of the region. Why? Because it will become more predictable and more sustainable. This region needs stability. It has all the economic preconditions to be very successful. And I think that Georgia also demonstrates this with this series of reforms that we have conducted, that we could make actually Georgia a modern European country with rule of law and with many achievements, which actually is, and all these international rankings are very good evidence that Suma mentioned. At the same time, although we have these challenges, so Georgia also demonstrated that we can deliver stability, security, and predictability, because you can have an excellent tax regime, but if you have issues with stability or predictability, no investor will come to your homes, to your state. So I think that our aspirations to become a member of EU and NATO is in the best interest of the region, because this will help the region itself to unlock its very high economic value that we have mentioned many times today.
From an outside perspective, Vali Nasser, do you see it this way? And where do you see the Russian connection in this whole regard, Russia's role? Because, again, a lot of Russians believe that this is the traditional sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, and that they believe that the West, in many respects, is trying to keep them away.
Well, I think exactly this is the tension here. In other words, you have states that their interest lies with Europe, and also they see integration with NATO and European Union as the best way of protecting their ambitions from what might be a Russian or Iranian or Turkish agenda here. But in reality, there's a lot of things up in the air. First of all, whether or not European Union, given its current circumstances, would have appetite for moving eastward, given the fact that in the face of the Abkhazia, South Ossetia situation and the case of Ukraine, every time when the Russians have actually asserted themselves, the West has actually blinked. It has not reversed these sets of situations. Thirdly, I would say that the situation of Turkey with Europe and with NATO is right now up in the air. I mean, a lot of the ways in which the West might have thought about the future of Caucasus was tied to the fact that Turkey was destined to move closer to Europe, and Turkey was a close member of NATO. Now, President Erdogan is spending more time in Moscow than he does in Washington or in any European capital. We have to look at a future where the accession talks with Turkey may be completely abandoned altogether. And then the question is, how does Turkey look at one of the Caucasus states moving closer to Europe, and how it would react to such a scenario? And then finally, I would say, if you looked at the case of Azerbaijan, I mean, Azerbaijan, much like Georgia, was looking to building a relationship with Israel on the one side, with Turkey, with the United States, and increasingly watching what's happened with Georgia, and particularly after Ukraine, it has become much more neutral. Again, there are continuous trilateral meetings with the president of Iran, president of Russia and the president of Azerbaijan in Baku, in Tehran, is that Azerbaijan sort of has decided that leaning too far to the West may actually provoke the Russians, and the best way of protecting what Azerbaijan's ambitions is to sort of temper that enthusiasm for the West. But I think all of this goes to the point that there's not one single view here about how to protect what this region wants and aspires, and how to actually really manage these big gorillas, if you're saying, that are sitting around this region and have clearly much more interest in this region than right now the United States or even the European Union have.
Yeah, it's interesting, Karen Kneissel, one question to you before I go back to the audience for another possible question just behind me. I'll come to you in a second. But we talk about the tensions, the conflicts, of course, they are there. We talk about trade wars, virtual wars. But what about, and we're sitting here talking about Eurasia in a global context, but this global context could so radically change, couldn't it, if the real war took shape? And I'm thinking about Iran, who knows? But the European position quite distinctly different to the United States and China's and the rest of the world. Do you foresee any kind of conflict like this taking shape, and how would it affect this region, do you think?
I'm still confident that there will not be an open-fledged war with Iran. I've been going to Iran over the last 20 years at least once a year, and I think I'm one of the few who had the chance to both travel to Tehran and to Tel Aviv giving a lecture, and both knew of each other. And unfortunately,
both
never
stamped your passport and allowed you to come in.
I know that, but lucky. Maybe I was just lucky. Maybe it was for the simple reason that they both knew that I was there as a lecturer and nothing more. I remember days when people said, "No, next week there will be a war and it's building up," and all this, music that is then built up. And it never happened. And I'm pretty sure it will not happen.
And you say it won't happen because?
It won't happen because it's not in the interest of any party. It's not in the interest of the United States. I remember also when we had the WikiLeaks of 2009, I think, the then Secretary of Defense went to Saudi Arabia. It was the WikiLeaks telegrams from the US Embassy in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis were asking for an attack. And Gates said, "No way, we are not interested in attacking Iran." That was under the Bush administration.
An interesting partnership between the Saudis and some Gulf countries and Israel.
Yeah.
On this.
Israel is called in some think tanks the leader of the Sunni world in Washington. We do have here interesting watershed lines that are rebuilt. I'm pretty sure there won't be a war against Iran. And I'm somehow confident that with time we'll see that this concept of with whom you can work in the region on what. I mean, the Iranians under the most difficult times didn't quit the country to the same extent. People started quitting the one or the other emirate when the real estate prices crumbled. When the people are just then looking for where the grass is greener, that people don't do to the same extent in Iran. And so I'm confident that no war will happen. We'll see all kinds of other conflicts, unfortunately, but no war.
An optimistic note. A question from the audience?
Yes, this question is for Mr. Kemka and Mr. Chakrabarty, and then maybe others in the panel if they have an opinion. We've talked a lot about investments in infrastructure, but to create true stability in the region in the long term, if you believe the World Bank, and per dollar investment in human capital as opposed to infrastructure creates more long-term stability and growth. I'd like you to comment on what you believe for this region are appropriate investments in human capital to avoid, for example, a youth unemployment crisis. We've seen India lead in many ways in that balance, and what you believe we should be doing in the region.
2 brief answers, please, and then we'll wrap up with all panelists.
Kazakhstan again led the way. They created something called Bolashak, the Bolashak program, 22 years ago, which was to actually create a financial aid for students to study abroad globally. and they sent them in 3 directions: US, Europe, and China. And many of those have come back. They had to come back. And today, if you go to the ministries, the companies, etc., you find these Bolashak scholars running the country today. So I think there was an understanding of that. And I think the other countries are now starting to follow that as well. Uzbekistan is very excited about human capital development.
Thank you very much.
Well, not a lot to add to that. I mean, I think actually I've seen these people coming back like in Kazakhstan. Some of them ended up Oxford University. My wife taught them. They've turned up back in Kazakhstan. It's great. I think beyond that, though, is thinking more long-term about the skills agenda in these countries. And I'm not sure, and I wouldn't just say these countries in Eurasia. I think many of the countries EBRD works in North Africa as well haven't yet really got serious policies on what are the skills gaps and therefore what sort of education do you need. The join-up between employers, for example, and the education industry is not as good as it should be. So we're putting more money into things like sector skills councils and others to try and actually have a better dialogue between what the demand side of the equation, if you like, and the supply side as well. I think that's going to be something that we want to see more of these countries doing.
Thanks, Mr. Chakrabarti. To you, Prime Minister, if you can answer and also wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Well, I totally agree with the logic because human capital development is main for any nation. In Georgia, we are starting a new education sector reform with a final aim to make an education sector a dominant sector in our economy, so it is no less than 10 or 11% of the GDP, and I think that that should be the final goal and the main benchmark for other nations as well. And we are doing great, as you know, in doing business. We are number 6, and I do hope that with that reform we will have such achievements in human capital index after some time. I would like to highlight once again, and let me repeat myself, that indeed this region has enormous economic potential, and of course with joint efforts we have to unlock this economic value for the global economy to make the growth of this part of the world more sustainable. And absolutely, I'm sure that this part of the world has all the preconditions to become the main driver of the economic growth on the Eurasian continent.
Thank you very much, Radi Nasser. In 30 seconds or so, do you agree? Where do you see the region heading?
No, I agree. I think the human capital development in the longer run is very critical for countries that are in an economic transformation phase and also have large numbers of youth. You have to not only create jobs in the short run, but also issues of dignity, demand for social and political rights become increasingly important as you go forward.
Suma Chakrabarti, how optimistic do you remain?
I remain very optimistic. I think this is a region on the right track, with the right leadership, the right policy reforms. And I sort of agree with Karen. I think actually the geopolitical tensions are not likely to play out into any massive open conflict. There will be frozen conflicts, and that's a problem. But I think not the open conflict. So I think there is opportunity here for investors to come in with or without EBRD.
Mr. Kemka, your final
Yes,
thoughts.
I'm very optimistic. I'm particularly optimistic about Uzbekistan. In the last year, President Mirziyoyev has done a tremendous job opening up, trying to open up, trying to focus on some key sectors. And I think it'll be one of the bright spots over the coming years. And we're looking forward as a group to invest more there. We've already invested in Kazakhstan, looking to invest more in Uzbekistan.
Is this picture too rosy for you, Karen Kneissel? Are we being too overly optimistic, or do you see the future this way from your strategic vantage point?
By nature, I'm a skeptic. And I think we always have to think in scenarios.
I think that's the former journalist in you.
Yeah, maybe, but it's not a paved way. There's always a black swan that can appear on the horizon we haven't yet heard about, and it can be there. So it's very good also for the mental exercise to think in different scenarios and be ready for a plan B, C, D, whatever it needs. But I do hope for the region that they also can maintain their specificities. I hope that they can avoid some of the mistakes we committed elsewhere, whether it was in tourism, whether it was in how we in Europe and in the Northwestern Hemisphere destroyed agriculture. We created meat industry and we gave up the respect for the living creature. And this is something that the nomads in Central Asia still do. I admire the way they treat the animals, which we forget.
And as a famous Austrian writer says, history teaches a lot of lessons, but has few pupils
Yeah.
listening. But I don't mean to end on a negative note. Thank you to all of the panelists for a fascinating discussion. I think all of us agree that this is very much a region on the move with a lot of potential, a lot to offer, a dynamic, young, and interesting new changes and leaderships as well. So thank you all very much indeed for being here and for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the very nice